Okay, I want to pick up where we left off from the last video. We were talking about the idea that God is dead. That is, that God is incredible. God is no longer believable. And I said at the very end that the death of God by modern science is not just the death of God, it's the death of science itself. That is, science and technology and their success kill God, but accidentally or unknowingly, in a certain sense, kill themselves. And so Nietzsche says something like this. So the death of God is the suicide or the simultaneous suicide of science itself. But this truth, people can come to sort of accept the idea of secularization, the death of God, but the idea that science itself, as scientia, as knowledge of the world, as it is in its truth, is also something that dies along with the death of God. This is much harder for people to accept. And Nietzsche thinks a big problem is modern atheism. That is, atheists aren't as atheistic as they should be. Or rather, atheists, he says, are pale atheists. They're really Christian atheists. They still want to keep a lot of Christianity. They want to keep truth, and they want to keep the Christian ethics. We'll talk about the ethics in another video. But right now I want to talk about why atheistic modern science is still Christian, because it still believes in truth. And so Nietzsche's critique goes something like this. Atheistic modern science is just as theistic as the theism it sought to overcome. Or atheistic modern science, for Nietzsche, is just as Christian as the Christianity it thought it had overcome. That is, atheists who think they have the truth are still Christians. Now, why? 2 points. Number one, science itself for Nietzsche is a Christian project. Science itself for Nietzsche is a Christian project. That is, it's not a coincidence that science developed in the Western world for Nietzsche. What science needs to presuppose about the world is something that is just intuitive to the Christian, namely that the world is intelligible, or that the world is ordered, or that the world is designed. And if the world is designed and the world is ordered, it assumes that there's a designer or an orderer or an intellect. So, I mean, think about it. One of the things that a scientist has to assume when he or she goes into the laboratory or whatever to experiment is that there's some kind of intelligibility, there's some kind of order, there's some kind of design here in the world that we can figure out. And a lot of science is mathematical. And why is it that mathematics maps onto reality so well? Isn't it strange that if science is telling us about the world as it really is, why is the world ordered like that? Why is the world intelligible? Nietzsche thinks that this is a Christian presupposition that the world is intelligible. Okay, so the development of modern science in the West wasn't a coincidence, but rather comes out of Christianity and Christianity's will to truth, or desire for truth. That is God. Okay? Second point, the death of God affects this. Why? Because the death of God is simultaneously the death of truth. God is truth. Jesus says, I'm the truth. But it's not just the death of the idea of truth. It's the death of the idea that we can assume the world is ordered by an intellect. Okay? And here's Darwin's point. What Nietzsche thinks Darwin reveals is that there is no truth, or that behind truth is the will to power. In other words, the intellect that we think, or reason, that searches for the truth, this desire to know. Aristotle says at the beginning of his Metaphysics, all people by nature desire to know. Well, Nietzsche says, but if we take Darwin seriously, that what's behind this desire to know is not a need to stand and behold the glory of creation. No, it's a will to power. So behind the will to truth is, again, will to power. In other words, knowledge is desire for control. Knowledge, or the desire for knowledge, or the desire for truth, is the desire to control and even oppress nature. Descartes says this in the 6th chapter of the Discourse on Method. The hope with science will be that we become masters and possessors of nature. Bacon says knowledge is power. In other words, Nietzsche thinks that what Darwin reveals is that the intellect, rationality, is not looking for truth, it's just looking for control. Okay? So the things that we think are true could simply be useful to us or beneficial. In other words, they need not necessarily be true. Because remember, science, as scientia, means knowledge of the truth. It means that we can track an order to reality. Nietzsche's saying that's not what science is. Modern science is a technological project. It's not about knowing what the world is or how the world functions. That's only secondary, and that's a useful fiction. Really, what science is about manipulation and control. Okay, so the question obviously comes up, wait a minute, if science is not true, why does it work? Why do we have such success in modern science and technology? And there's two positions. It's really the same position in what's called the philosophy of science, called instrumentalism or Kuhnianism, popularized by a guy named Thomas Kuhn. He wrote a book called Structures of Scientific Revolutions. And the idea here is that of an instrumentalist or a Kuhnian, that if you look at the way science operates, it operates according to paradigms that are often successive of one another and in contradiction to one another. So, Einstein replaces and succeeds Newton, and they don't quite fit together. Or quantum theory doesn't quite fit perfectly with Einstein. There's a problem of reconciling gravity in those two theories. It's called the problem of commensurability or incommensurability. And so if you look at the one is perfectly legitimate to see the history of science as not the history of successive progress toward better and better knowledge of the truth, but better and better technology, and merely technology. So we could simply have this idea about the world that simply works, and we don't know why. Now there's a philosopher of science, you don't need to know this, named Larry Loudon, who details, I think 20 or so, maybe it's something like 11, doesn't matter, theories in science that were completely false but worked. An obvious example that Kuhn brings up is the Ptolemaic navigation system, which was based on geocentric model of the universe that worked. So you could have a completely false theory, but for some reason it works. It just hitches on to something in reality. And so Nietzsche thinks that our progress in science doesn't necessarily mean that it's telling us anything true about the world. There's more and more scientists are coming to this philosophical position on science called instrumentalism, namely that science doesn't yield any knowledge to us about the way the world actually is, about the intelligibility of the world. It's actually just getting better and better at controlling the world. Okay? So for Nietzsche, there's no problem in saying that science dies along with the death of God. Science is just about power. Okay? The intellect is a lie factory. Its job is not to tell us the truth about the world. Its job is to make us survive or help us to survive. So what appears true to us can merely be useful or beneficial to survival. So that's what Darwin's project reveals. He reveals that, or Nietzsche thinks he reveals that, the will to truth has destroyed itself in modern science with the revelation of Darwin that we're all animals. We don't have anything like reason. Reason is merely an algorithmic function trying to help us survive. I'll post a video by this, his name escapes me at the moment. He's a evolutionary psychologist who's come to the similar position that we have no idea what the world actually is. The world is, the way the world appears to us is beneficial for us to survive. And what we read off the world in terms of modern science is the same thing. It's beneficial to survive. So Nietzsche thinks that if you're a scientist, an atheistic scientist, and you think you're getting at the truth of the world, and science is reading off the truth, you don't really understand the history of science very well, and you don't understand the implications of Darwinian science on what truth is. Now, this presents, in case you're wondering if this might have occurred to you already, a problem for Nietzsche. That is, what's the problem if the will to truth has destroyed itself? What's the problem if there is no truth, only power? Well, the problem is that true? Is Nietzsche's philosophy true, self-referentially? In other words, if there's no truth, only power, is that statement itself true? If there is no truth, only power, then that means that statement itself, self-referentially, isn't true. It's just a power statement. In other words, the whole system collapses on itself. The whole thing blows up with the discovery of Darwin. Darwin says, okay, wow, we realize that there is no truth, that the mind is evolutionarily adaptive. And I could merely think that because it's evolutionarily adaptive. It's successful for me to think that. I don't know that it's true. I just know that it works. And that's a big difference for Nietzsche. He thinks we need to really get past this idea that we're getting at the truth. Now, of course, why would Nietzsche say that? Doesn't that render everything Nietzsche says false? He says, well, yeah, there is no truth. Everything I say is a lie. This harkens back to an old philosophical position or a philosophical dilemma called the liar's paradox. And you imagine someone saying, everything I say is a lie. Well, if everything I say is a lie, isn't that a lie? And that's not true. So that, in other words, the problem becomes one of how do you articulate this? This will come up later in chapter 3 of the Genealogy, particularly chapter 24 or section 24 of chapter 3 or essay 3. So read that. But think about this. The death of God is the death of truth. And if there's no truth, then the whole process of predication collapses. And also think about, we'll talk about this one more time when we get to the end, that Nietzsche thinks atheism is hypocritical. And in the next video, I'll just read a couple passages that are really important where Nietzsche says this.